Jump back into our discussion of the Texas political culture that we started on Tuesday, and I'm having a hard time finding my thing that I opened. Give me just a second here. Why is it not showing up? Pretty sure I opened this. There it is.
Can I ask you a question?
You can.
Okay, and I've been just seeing this in the news a lot, and I've never heard of anything like this, and I didn't even know it was possible. But so you can impeach someone once they're out of office still? Or is
Are you talking about President Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this really isn't a topic for this course, but since you asked the question, I'm going to say he was impeached before he was out of office.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just had no idea. I was very confused.
Now, people use that term impeach to mean something that it doesn't mean.
Okay.
What the critics are really objecting to is the trial.
Mm-hmm.
He has already been impeached. In fact, he's been impeached twice.
Yeah.
Huh?
Can I ask a question on that? That's the part I don't understand. Okay, like where I come from, when you get impeached, you have to leave office. So how come when you say impeachment in the US, how do you impeach someone and they still run the office?
Well, I guess the quick answer to your question is, and again, I'm happy to talk about this kind of stuff with you, but we can't let it be interfere with it. But the quick answer is our Constitution establishes a two-step process. Okay, if you're familiar with the criminal justice system, and we have a topic in this course later in the semester on criminal justice, so it's not too far afield. Okay, and at the state level in Texas, there is an impeachment process for elected officials. Like we have had a governor impeached and removed from office in Texas, but it's kind of like in the criminal justice, and I making the comparison to the criminal justice system when we talk about impeachment is a little dangerous, because then people want to begin applying all kinds of other standards of the criminal justice system, and you can bet that President Trump's lawyers are going to do that. They're going to try in his defense in the trial. They're going to try to make arguments about freedom of speech and that sort of stuff. I'm betting that they will. Which may be very relevant in a criminal case, but this is not a criminal case. It's a political case, okay? So having said that, I just want to caution you that these comparisons to the criminal justice process only go so far. But it is like the criminal justice system in the sense that it's a two-step process. Some of you may know, for example, that we have two different kinds of juries in the criminal justice system. You have grand juries and you have just regular old trial juries, are actually technically called petit juries, okay? And what is the role of the grand jury? Well, the role of the grand jury is to review the evidence that the prosecution has and make a determination about whether there's enough evidence to go to trial, to put this person on trial. And if the grand jury thinks that there's enough evidence, then they issue an indictment. If they think there's not enough evidence, then they no bill is the term that they use. They no bill, right? So in some ways, it's kind of like this. What the House of Representatives does is determine whether there's enough evidence to go to trial. And if the House of Representatives determines that there's enough evidence to go to trial, they impeach the president, okay? Or it doesn't have to be just the president. There are other officials that can be impeached as well, federal judges and cabinet secretaries and so on, right? So in this case, the majority of the House of Representatives believe that there was enough evidence to put Donald Trump on trial. And so they impeached him, and then now they're going to have a trial in the Senate. Now, the question that so many people are debating is, well, he's already out of office. You can't put a former president, someone who's not president now, on trial. Well, that's a question to be determined, right? The fact of the matter is that they are going to do it, right? So apparently you can do it, right? And again, to those people who would say there's no precedent for it, I say you're right, there is no precedent for it. Donald Trump is the precedent. He's the precedent setter. His behavior in the last 2 weeks of his presidency set the precedent for what we have to address now, which is, can a former president be convicted? So it's all by virtue of what the president, Donald Trump, did or did not do that led the House of Representatives to issue that indictment, so to speak, that article of impeachment. And we'll see what happens in the Senate.
Gotcha. Because I knew I knew it was approved somewhere. I just didn't know when,
Yeah.
what time.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Keep watching, keep paying attention, and it'll all unfold in the near future. We'll see what happens, right?
You're going to be impeached, it doesn't mean you're taken out of office.
The result of impeachment by the House of Representatives does not mean you're removed from office. There has to be a trial in the Senate, and then the Senate has to, under the U.S. Constitution, if that's what we're talking about at the national level, and we're talking about the president, the Senate has to convict by a 2/3 vote. And of course, in his first trial, after the Ukrainian thing, right, that led to that first impeachment, they didn't have enough votes. Prior 2/3 of the senators didn't even come close, right? It'll probably be a little closer this time, but most people who are saying that there probably are not enough votes there to convict them. But we'll see. Okay, as much as I would love to continue talking about that, believe me, we are just going to have to move on. I've lost it again. What keeps happening to my PDF file? There it is.
Yeah.
Hey, for those of you who are online, can you hear me? Raise your hand. Those of you who are online, can you hear me? Do I even have anybody online here? Yeah, 5 people online. Can you all hear me? Oh, they are. Okay, thank you. Tell me what you see on your screen. Do you see Elazar's 3 culture types? Oh, I know what's wrong. Somebody keeps turning this off. That's why I can't hear them raise their hand. I rely on the audio stimulus to hear them. Okay, I think you're all with me anyway. All right, so we had started talking last time about Elazar's 3 culture types. We had talked, for example, about the geographical pattern that Elazar identifies, the idea that the moralistic political culture is the northern tier of states, for the most part, the northern tier of states. The individualistic culture is found in the middle tier of states, and the traditionalistic culture is found in the southern tier of states. But we talked about the fact that those patterns were set by patterns of 19th century migration. But we also said that many states have a strong subculture as well. Elazar says that many states have a strong subculture as well. For example, Texas has a dominant traditionalistic culture, but a strong individualistic subculture as well. And he explains that in terms of more recent patterns of migration, principally the 20th century, where people migrated more north to south. Okay? All right, so ultimately then we said that what he really seems to be interested in are these localized cultures. I mean, you'd have to read his book yourself if you were that interested, but I do want you to be aware that he is particularly interested in the phenomenon of cultures at a local level. Okay? Remember last time we were talking about national political community, state political community, and then local political community. So there's a political culture associated with each of those. Who remembers what label we put on the national political culture? What's the term that we used last time to describe the national political culture? The values consistent with the national political culture are, no, that's, what? Well, that's part of the structure of political thought. You have these fundamental assumptions, right? And then you have these specific values that flow from, it's not in this version. You have these specific values that flow from these fundamental assumptions, and among them are liberty, order, equality, rule of law, justice, localism, national unity, democracy, competitive individualism, and so on. I don't remember the entire list, right? It's really not, that part of it's really not a topic for us to get into systematic discussion in this course. That's something I go into some detail in the 2305 course. I'm just trying to get you to give me the one word that we use to describe the national political culture. trying to get you to recall that it is a liberal culture. Remember, we're using that term liberal not in the sense that it's used in the popular political debate where we talk about liberals versus conservatives. You've got to unencumber yourself from that understanding of liberal. It doesn't mean that it didn't mean that historically. It hasn't meant that traditionally. It doesn't mean that for this course, okay? The modern connotations of liberal versus conservative come from the muddying of liberalism about 100 years ago. Right? So if it helps you to, divorce yourself from that understanding of liberal, put the word classical in front of it. Right? The dominant system of thought in the United States has been classical liberalism. Right? And the values that are consistent with the American political culture are classical liberal values. Okay? Now, again, Elazar is not disputing that. Elazar is, I think, fully on board with the idea that American political culture has been a liberal political culture. But we are, as I said last time, we are a big enough society, geographically and population-wise. We are a diverse enough society that you would expect that there would be some variations in liberal political culture across this great land, okay? And that's where he comes up with this moralistic, individualistic, and traditionalistic scheme. It's still liberal. In moralistic political communities, the prevailing values are still liberal values. In traditionalistic communities, the prevailing values are still liberal values, okay? Didn't we talk about that last time? Didn't I ask you, for example, do Texans and New Yorkers and Californians alike not all embrace the value of liberty? Of course. Equality. Right? Yeah, sure. Despite the fact that we're so different from one another in terms of race, ethnicity, educational achievement, income level, religious affiliation, geography, whatever, however you want to slice it up, American society is really no other way to describe it, quite diverse. Yet the thing that seems to have, at least up to this point, hold American civil society together is our common values. And they're liberal values. By the way, even so-called conservatives, people who think of themselves as conservatives, know that when they take the big picture view. I remember so well when George W. Bush was president. You all remember George W. Bush? Okay. Would you consider him a liberal or a conservative? Yeah, sure. I mean, he was a conservative. Called himself a conservative. Called himself a compassionate conservative. Okay. When George W. Bush talked about the war on terror, right, and the values of those who would wage war on the United States, or wage a war of terror on the United States, having values that were inconsistent with liberal thought, he would use that term, right? Those are not the old values of the communist systems in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union. You know what they viewed as, we viewed Soviet communism as the threat to our way of life. You know what they viewed as the threat to their way of life? Liberal political values and the emphasis on individual freedom. All I'm really trying to say to you is that term liberal, the way we're using it here, is more consistent with that understanding of liberalism rather than the kind of understanding that people have in the media, or the pundits have, or the politicians have when they talk about liberals or conservatives. That's not really the way we're using that term here. Okay? Okay, so anyway, we started talking about Elazar's three culture types. I think we had gotten through moralism. I think we also gotten through individualism, right? Okay? Tell you what, before we move on to traditionalism, and I think we even kind of scratched the surface on traditionalism last time, let me just give you an opportunity to ask any questions about anything you want to clarify with either moralistic culture or individualistic culture.
Real fast, we went over why it was viewed as dirty, like kind of like individualistic culture viewing like going into politics, and that like, but why is it only professionals that are allowed?
Well, what that means, I think what Elazar means by that is that people who are by their vocation politicians.
Oh, so just by like their job, like that's just.
I guess, yeah. I mean, that might be one thing. They're people who have spent their professional careers being politicians.
Okay, so if you were, so say if like that was not your job and then you went into that kind of just like that, like just, it's kind of like look a little bit down on, yes, or.
I think there's some truth to that. I think that in individualistic communities, politics is not a high calling, right?
Yeah.
It is something that is sort of looked down upon, right? That why would anybody who has a successful career in, say, business want to go into politics? That's kind of, I'm not saying that's accurate way of viewing it. I'm saying that I believe Elazar would tell us that that's the way that people in these communities look at it. Yes, sir.
What I was gonna say, so you have these business people that make a lot of money, they want more influence where they are, so they help out the politicians, and they kind of like, I wouldn't say bribe them, because that would be.
Getting involved.
They get more involved in their community, because like, hey, we need this fixed, I wanna see you in office more, because you can lower this, you can help me out. So
Yeah.
it's like a mutual thing, it's like they help each other out, so I don't know how, yeah, it is dirty, but at the same time, I don't know how the rich people see the dirty.
Well, that's a more complicated notion that you're throwing out there than it seems at first glance. So that's the reason I chuckle a little bit, because I'm not really sure where to begin to respond. let me just say this, that you're right. People in the business community, people in other walks of life, other professions, engage in politics.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's helpful, although I don't think Elazar exclusively means this, but maybe it's helpful to think about it in terms of electoral politics. You know, there was a time in this country where people who were successful in the business community did not aspire to elective office. That's a really fairly new thing in American politics, where a truly successful business person, the last thing that they would have wanted to do was run for office. They might have seen it as diminishing their influence, okay? But beginning around a quarter of a century ago, something like that, I don't know if you all recognize the name Ross Perot.
Mm-hmm.
Ross Perot was not the first, but he was one of the first big, wealthy businessmen that ran for president, okay? But, you know, over the last quarter century or so, you've had people who have had successful business careers run not only for president, but senator and representative and so on. It's not uncommon really anymore, or it's certainly not a shock to anyone when someone who has had a successful business career decides that they want to run for public office. All I'm telling you is that there used to be a time when that just didn't happen. It was very rare. Okay? Yeah, I mean, you know, on the other hand, you have had historically in some parts of the country where so-called professional politicians haven't really shied away from that, okay? The last thing that a politician these days seems to want to do is label themselves a politician, because they kind of understand that there's this really negative connotation associated with it. Yeah, with being a politician, but you know, it wasn't that long ago where that wasn't necessarily the case. You know, many professional politicians would refer to themselves as politicians. Okay? So I don't know if that helps at all, but
Yeah.
when he talks about professional politics.
It's difficult for me to like understand, because I was just like, man, 5:30, like, I don't know.
Yes, sir.
This description of individualistic kind of has a lot of, they just seem like more downsides.
Mm-hmm.
How many, I mean, for it to exist, there should be at least like some sides, some pros to it, right? So.
Well, I mean, I just think it depends on your perspective. I think there are a lot of people who would say, maybe point to something like this and say, largely economic, encouraging private initiative, access to the market. Yeah, that's exactly economic development, the highest priority. Yeah, some people say that's a positive. That's a positive of this political culture. Isn't that what we, for example, here in Texas, I think there are many people involved in business and in politics who would say that's exactly what government's supposed to be doing. That's not a negative, that's a positive. There's a bit of conventional wisdom that you hear people in Texas, for many, many decades up until now, repeat, over in Austin and around the state. What's good for business is good for Texas, right?
See, I was gonna say, that could be seen as, it's kind of the middle ground, because it depends. It could be good, it could be bad, because some politicians, they don't act for the, I guess you can say, the people's best interest. It's really just them. And the same with the businesses. I'm only doing this to benefit my business. I don't really care about anything else. So then they go, politician, do this for me, and I'll do something, I'll throw an event for you. So it's literally, that's a middle ground. It just depends on the politician.
Well, that's a popularly expressed viewpoint of people who are alienated from politics and who really don't see politicians acting in their interests. And there's some truth to it, okay? But I doubt that there are very many people in public life, politicians, who would say, if you confronted them, if you said, you're not really representing, the people, you're not looking out for the interests of the people, I think they're going to snap back very quickly and say, yes, I am. I'm absolutely looking out for the interests of my constituents. It just may be that they view their constituents more narrowly than,
obviously red, blue, like, I care about my people on my side. I wasn't specific, I care about people on my side.
Okay, good. Anything? Those are all good observations. Anything else?
Although if they're helping the economy and helping businesses, that also can help with job growth, which is also important.
They're certainly very quick to make that point, right? Low taxes, little regulation is good for business. And that means job creation. I find it interesting that people in the business community almost always make their arguments in favor of low taxes and less government regulation in terms of job creation and job growth. They're not going to make the argument in terms of it's good for the bottom line. It's not good for my stock portfolio, right? They're going to make the argument in terms of, hey, we're creating jobs for people. Right?
Lots of things have pros on.
Sure. Okay. All right, very good. Excellent, excellent. I'm glad you guys are thinking about these things. And, in so many areas of politics, I wish it was not so. I wish it was otherwise, but it's just very nuanced. There's very little that we can point to and just say black and white. This is it's just all full of subtleties and nuance and perspective. Remember that what I told you at the beginning of this class, that 99% of politics, when we talk about the political world, perception is 99% of reality. Yes, ma'am. Well, I can't leave it up there for very long, okay? Because we do need to move along, okay? And this was up here on, I actually would really prefer that you guys not do that, okay? Did I not mention that to you all in the first class meeting? Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's several reasons for that, but what I really try to emphasize to people is don't feel obligated to take down every syllable and every word that's on the screen, okay? You're certainly never going to be tested in that way. Try to come away with the broad strokes and so on, because most of these slides aren't going to be up there long enough for you to do that, okay? And I worry about, among other things, it's certainly not the only reason, but I worry about, the dissemination of that information to people and the effect that it has on people coming to class and so on, but also the perception that just possessing information is the same thing as learning information.
I wouldn't even look at it. As I take a picture of it, I'm good. And you go, but can you give one example of moralistic, example of a moralistic idea that would be passed through that people would enjoy?
I'm not sure if I follow your question exactly. You mean in terms of public policy?
Yeah, like, so viewed as a commonwealth, achieve the good of the community through positive action. And then it says, non-governmental action preferred. So like, what would the example be?
Okay, let me answer it this way, and you can tell me if this satisfies you.
Okay.
Okay? I used to have a map that I carried around with me, and I stopped doing it because I don't dealing more with, you know, images on the screen and stuff like that. But it was a map of the United States, all the states, coded by the child staff ratios that were legislated by the state legislatures in daycare centers. Okay? In other words, does the state have a law in the books that requires or that limits the number of children in a daycare center for each adult caregiver?
Say no more. I get it
Okay?
now. Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying.
LSR would say expect to find in states that have more rigorous ratios, expect that to occur in moralistic communities, and expect it to occur higher ratios, more children per staff member in individualistic and traditionalistic communities. Because moralistic communities embrace regulatory efforts if it's perceived to be for the good of the community. Whereas in individualistic cultures, they might worry more about how the businesses, the daycares operating as businesses.
Spending more money getting into the school.
Exactly.
I see that. Okay. Because I was a little confused, but now I get it.
Now, there are going to be some more policy examples we're going to look at, and I hope that those will drive this home as well. Okay? All right, let's move on to traditionalistic culture. As we said last time, traditionalistic culture is mainly the South, southern states. They view, people in these traditionalistic communities view government as a means of maintaining the existing social, economic, and political order. What does that mean in just not terribly detailed terms? The people who have power keep the power. The people who have the wealth keep the wealth. The people who have the social status keep the social
I
status.
want the government to leave me alone as much as possible.
I'm sorry?
Basically, like, I want the government I want as little government involvement in most things as possible. I just kind of want
No,
Are you saying that's the way traditionalistic views it, or are you saying that's the way you view it?
No, that's what just
no, like, there's
Oh, okay.
also.
Well, it seems to work out that way, but if the elite, if the governing elite, if the people with wealth, status, and power, LSR would say, if in these southern communities, the people with wealth, status, and power see it in their interest for government to act, then government will act. Okay?
Which is what we talked about earlier, the politicians and the rich people coming together. Could be a bad thing, could be good, but politicians and rich people are hand in hand.
I think that LSR would say, and remember, I'm trying to represent the views of a person not here to represent himself. Okay, but LSR's culture scheme has been pretty widely applied by political scientists, and even the authors of your textbook introduce you to LSR's culture scheme, right? For those of you who've got that far in your reading assignment. So, I mean, I'm not the only one who's introducing you to LSR, right? I think LSR would say that oftentimes in traditionalistic communities, these are leaders of the business community, frequently leaders of the business community, but it's not so much the fact that they're business leaders, but it's the fact that their wealth and their power and their social status are all intimately tied together. And if they perceive it in their view as being beneficial to their interests, then it's perfectly okay for government to act.
nah, we need this money. That's just a kind of traditionalistic thing.
When we get to our topic on the Constitution, the Texas Constitution, we're going to talk a lot about the constitutional referendum process in Texas. And we'll probably have an opportunity at that juncture to look at some of the specific amendments that have been added to the Constitution, particularly in recent years. And it raises serious questions about, well, now, who really supports this, okay? I don't want to jump too far ahead, but just one example that pops into my head that kind of sticks out is back in, before, say, 1996 or 1997, in Texas, homeowners could not take out loans against the equity in their home. That was not possible in Texas. In other states, it was possible. A home equity loan in other states you could get Texas you could not. And one of the reasons for that is that there was really no provision in the Constitution allowing the legislature to set up a regulatory apparatus for that, okay? Now, after, I can't remember exactly what year it was, for some reason I think it was 1997, an amendment was offered to voters of the state of Texas that would permit that, and it was approved by voters, and so today, homeowners in Texas can take out loans against the equity in their homes, but it makes one wonder, well, why did that happen? You know, like what happened sort of behind the scenes that we went from not having the possibility of getting home equity loans in Texas here, and then as a result of an amendment that was added in it. And here's the way that, I hope I'm not oversimplifying this too much, but here's the way I think that probably happened. You had bankers and, chairmen and CEOs of other lending institutions that were trying to expand their market for their products. And someone said, I imagine, sitting around a conference table and someone says, well, how can we expand our markets? Well, did you know down there in Texas, they don't have home equity loans? Well, why not? Their Constitution doesn't allow it. Okay? Well, get our lobbyists down there to Austin and get them to change that. I don't think that happened because homeowners in Texas were banging on the doors of banks and saying, we want home equity loans. We want home equity loans, right? Perhaps that's an example of how this kind of thing happens. Not just bankers up on Madison Avenue in New York, but really all around the country and including in Texas, right? Probably with a real impetus for getting that changed. So, there's an example of government acting, empowering government to act and set up a regulatory structure because it benefits, Elazar might say, because it benefits the financially well-heeled interests. Okay, appropriate areas of public policy include those that maintain traditional patterns. New programs will not be initiated unless they serve the interests of the governing elite, and that generally implies minimal government services. And as a general rule, whoever it was that said that, as a general rule, that's what I think it was is going to mean, we're just going to keep government out of things to the extent that we can.
We're going to keep everything the same until we have to do something.
That might be a way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Politics is viewed as a privilege. Only those with legitimate claim to public office should participate. And look at this. I think this is really key in the way that Elazar talks about traditional culture. Power is highly personal, based on family and social ties. Oftentimes in traditionalistic communities, there are one or two families that tend to dominate not only the economic and social life of the community, but the political life of the community as well. That's not as easy to see in the greater Houston area as it might be in other parts of Texas or the South, but there are places still in Texas and the South, mainly smaller communities, where that's really obvious, that there's one or two families that really tend to dominate the social, political, and economic life of the community. Historically, it was true in Houston as well, okay? But things do have changed in this large metropolitan area.
seems like that's how it is, like, more so nationally instead of, like, there's always those big names that you always hear.
Well, again, Elazar is saying that this is particularly a feature of the South. This is particularly a feature of Southern traditional political culture. That doesn't mean that there might be communities in other parts of the country where you have that as well, but this is a feature of traditional political culture.
The thing about that is, it's usually like, let's say, a big company in a small town. That big company, the family owns, has so much power because most of those people work at that big company. So they literally, that's their town, essentially.
And it's more pronounced, even in a place like Texas, it's more pronounced in some places than the other. I sort of suggested the urban-rural difference, but there's also geographically, we're not to this point yet, obviously, later in the semester we'll get to it. We used to talk about the old boss system in Texas, okay? Where particularly in South Texas, where large landowners just ran the show. And that had particularly important impacts for Latin American, like, workers on the farms and the ranches and so on, where these bosses, the so-called boss system, just dominated the landscape. Political parties serve as a means to recruit people to public offices not desired by established power holders. And I think we mentioned this actually in the last class meeting. A very characteristic feature of traditionalistic politics is one-party politics. You have a dominant political party in the South. Again, as I told you last time, when I began my illustrious professorial career, we used to talk about the solid South, the one-party South, where the Democratic Party was the dominant party, but it has since become the solid Republican South. It is one-party dominant Republican. Now, we do go through periods of transition, and you may be that you're seeing in some parts of the South. Maybe Georgia would be a good example since it's been in the news recently, where you're sort of where some would say you're transitioning to two-party competition. I'm not real fond of those red-blue kind of distinctions, but to the extent that you all have some understanding of what that means, some people, Georgia's becoming purple. It's not solid red, it's not solid blue. It's
It's mainly in cities with like really strong blue.
It is largely now a rural urban thing, right? Where urban areas tend to be strongly Democratic and rural areas tend to be strongly Republican.
Like you do Cold Cage, and then you have, Pasadena or something like that. Different areas, different ideals.
Okay. Elections, competition tends to be between elite dominant factions of a dominant party. The goal of winning public office depends on the political values of the dominant elite faction. Okay? So these are the main ideas that Elazar is laying out in terms of how people in traditionalistic cultures view government, public policy, and politics. Okay? Now, I want to share with you, his book is not about Texas, okay? There's only really a couple of places where he discusses Texas, to be honest with you. And I've lifted a couple of passages from the 1984 edition of his textbook. Remember I told you that originally he wrote this book back in the late 1960s. So this edition is the third edition, 20 years after, okay? And I want to just share with you these passages because I think it's a pretty good summation of what he means by the traditionalism and the individualism of the Texas political culture. So with respect to the traditionalism of Texas, he says, in Texas, the preservation of cultural patterns manifests itself concretely in wide circles as anti-federal, anti-social welfare, anti-tax radicalism tied in with the very clear economic interests in the state. That's Elazar. That's not Fagan. That's Elazar. Okay? Just want to be clear about that. Okay? What does he mean by anti-federal? He means we don't like those.
We don't want the.
Don't, yeah, some state highways, we don't want the federal government.
We don't want those bureaucrats in Washington telling us how to do our business, our business.
My uncle has said that exact sentence, that exact word for word.
Right.
They're like, well, we actually live in Texas, we're here all the time, you know, this is our state, we might know how to run it better than some guy who may never step pushing.
Now, look, that's a very commonly held view across the country. I mean, you could probably find that view expressed anywhere in this country. So there must be something different about the way that it manifests in traditionalistic communities, and particularly in Texas, that Elazar would say this. I mean, I don't think Elazar is, I think from Massachusetts, okay? Now, are there people in Massachusetts, including the large cities, Boston, who might say, well, we don't need those boneheads from Washington telling us what to do? Of course, right? But there's something about the way this manifests in traditionalistic culture that Elazar thinks it's unique, anti-federal. And frankly, to be honest with you, I think a lot of this has to do with the period in which Elazar wrote his book. Because in the 1960s, as you probably know, the country was going through a civil rights movement, okay? Well, but particularly with respect to the Black civil rights movement, and the arguments that were typically made in the South against integration were not on the merits of integration as much as they were on the national government dictating to the states. Wait a minute, I thought we had a federal system where the states were supposed to decide these kinds of, that's the kind of arguments that many, many people made in the debate over integration. We'll decide in Texas here what is good for Texas. In Alabama, let them decide for themselves what's good for Alabama. In Mississippi, let them, well, look, the political reality was that if you let Texas decide for Texas, if you let Alabama decide for Alabama, if you let Mississippi decide for Mississippi, that's very bad for African Americans as a general proposition. So if the national government steps in and passes civil rights legislation and says, we're not going to let the states do these kinds of things anymore, then the knee-jerk reaction in the South is going to be, oh, the national government's now dictating to us on what we should be doing in the states. You see what I'm saying about that? That's what I think Elazar means here about anti-federal.
It could be like leave us alone, but also like, man, you're not gonna tell us what to do. We want to be.
Yeah, I think it very much is that sort of mentality.
It's like, anything they're trying to pass feels like they're trying to yank power away from the people in Texas.
That's the way that it is frequently argued. But I suspect that historically, during this period of our history, that, what is really at root is that was an argument of convenience more than anything else. It's convenient to make that argument because that way you don't have to really make the argument about racial integration. Yep. That way you don't really have to make the argument about how you treat people fairly or unfairly, or as human beings or not as human beings. It's just much easier, much more convenient to make the argument about federalism. To a large extent, yes.
That's like an argument already built.
Yeah, like,
yes.
What's your point? How do you they're not supposed to bother us, the federal government? What about, integration? Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's
what does he mean by anti-social welfare? Well, that's, I think, relatively straightforward. We don't want to fund poverty relief programs in Texas. Again, there may be arguments of convenience there. Many people in traditionalistic communities tend to argue that the reason that you don't want to fund social welfare programs too high of a level is because it makes people dependent on the system, and that's bad that deprives them of the dignity of work and self-reliance and so on. And that may be true, right? But Elazar is a little bit more suspicious. Elazar is going to say, but what it really is about here is preserving the position of wealth and power for the elite. You see, because welfare programs have a redistributive effect, not only in terms of wealth, but in terms of economic, not only in terms of economic matters, but in terms of political influence as well. And if you redistribute wealth and power through these programs to segments of the society, segments of the community that previously did not have it, that means that the power elite no longer have as tight of a grip on the community as they once had.
If they know the government's helping them, they're gonna be more active in policies and stuff like that.
They could choose one side, they say that they're gonna give them money, so they'll probably vote for them, you know.
Yeah, hey, I'm gonna do this for y'all. I'm gonna vote.
That could be a threat to that party.
What do you think he means by this? Anti-tax radicalism.
They don't like.
That's, again, that's Elazar's words. He says in Texas, they're anti-tax radicals. Nobody likes paying taxes. Anybody in here like paying taxes? Am I the only person who likes paying taxes? You know, when April 15th rolls around and I pay my taxes, I put a little bit of extra in there. That's how much I like paying taxes. I put an extra $1,000 in there every year because, and just with a note that says, hey, spend this on whatever you want. Okay?
Johnny, you can control the federal government.
You actually do that?
Nobody likes paying taxes. I don't care if they're in Texas or Washington State or Massachusetts or Florida or wherever. Nobody wants to pay taxes, but he calls us anti-tax radicals. Again, there's something different about the way this manifests in Texas. Anti-tax radicalism, he says.
We're so strong on business. We're so.
Well, see, it's also gotta think about those other ideas, the ideas like for the social thing. That the reason why we're the way we are is because we know as Texans, if you break one up, that means we have to go up, which means more tax. That's how they're like, hey, you got welfare, cool for you. However, why did it have to come out of my wallet?
I want to look at some numbers here. I want to make sure we get to the point of looking at some numbers here. So let me finish off this second quote here, and then we can start talking about how that manifests. Okay. So that is the traditionalism of the Texas political culture. Now here's what he says about the individualism. Okay, individualism in Texas is exalted over community. Texans see few legitimate social goals as separate from private or individual goals. Economic development particularly excludes other matters from the public agenda. In other words, he's saying if there's one thing that you can get Texans to agree on, it's the importance of economic development. Okay? Whereas formerly segregation was the issue of the greatest internal unity. If you go back far enough, if you go back to the middle part of the 20th century, the one thing that you could get Texans to agree on would be keeping the races separate. Okay? That has given way to this emphasis on economic development, is what he says. That's the influence of individualism.
That's still low key, just a small thing. The economic development, that still has some separation in it though. They're smart with that because you put people in different areas and you build nice things away from those areas.
It is, you're pointing to what some refer to as the difference between de facto segregation and de jure segregation. And many people would argue that there's still, to a large extent, in many parts of the country, but certainly in Texas, a de facto segregation that, yeah. Okay, so bottom line, economic development is the political issue of the greatest internal unity in Texas. As I say, the one thing you can get Texans to agree on. All right, let's look at some indicators. Okay, if there's any truth or any validity, I should say, not truth is a poor choice of words. If there's any validity to Elazar's culture scheme, then we should expect to see something manifest in we can measure. Okay, so let's take first of all the views of each culture type towards political participation. Okay, and one of the things that we might look at to see, got to be careful here. We're not talking about cause and effect here. Okay, we may at best only be able to say that there seems to be some correlation, there seems to be some association. But if there is any validity to what Elazar says, you hypothesize for me, in which type of culture, in which communities, moralistic, individualistic, or traditionalist communities, would you expect to see the highest levels of participation, maybe measured by something very simple like voter turnout? Where would you expect to see in moralistic communities, in individualistic communities, and traditionalistic communities, the highest levels of voter turnout? Well, one seems like very logical hypothesis to test would be given what Elazar has to say about moralism, individualism, and traditionalism, is that you would expect to have the highest levels of voter turnout in moralistic states. And here's some data for you. You can look at the data as well as I can. This is from the 2012. This is kind of old data. I need to update this table. But trust me, it's a pattern that 2020 may show a little bit different pattern, but 2020 was such a weird, exceptional, I should say, such an exceptional election. But you can see in both 2012 and 2008, the states are ranked in terms of voter turnout. And if you just look at, say, the first 6 or 7 states there, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Colorado, New Hampshire, Iowa, these are all moralistic states. And look at the level of voter turnout. You're talking about, these are presidential elections, 76%, 73%. So about almost 3/4 of the eligible voters in those states voted in that election. Now, if you look at the bottom, right, you've got Kentucky, New Mexico, New York, Arizona, Tennessee, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, West Virginia, mainly traditionalistic states, right, with the lowest levels of voter. And again, this is not an exception. This is really the general rule going back quite a long time. 2020 may be the exception, okay? But look at voter turnout in Texas, under half, or right at half of eligible voters, making Texas 48 out of 51. I know you know there aren't 51 states, but that includes Washington, D.C., okay? So at the bottom of the list in terms of voter turnout, if you just eyeball the data, and this is not any kind of sophisticated statistical testing of data, but if you just kind of eyeball the data, you can kind of see a pattern there, right? Particularly at the bottom and the top.
And another thing is Texas is one of the biggest states on here, but only half its population will vote.
Yeah, that's why we use percentages of the electorate rather than the actual raw numbers, right?
Traditionalists believe there's a joke in politics we used to say, if Republicans had the same minds as Democrats, then this would be a Republican-run country. Because Republicans just don't like to go out and vote. They talk all this mess that they're going to do this, they're going to do that, but they don't actually go out and vote. Democrats will actually go out and vote and rally and do all this stuff. That's what I learned when I went to politics. That was the #1 joke. That's Texas.
Well, historically, in recent history, Republicans have voted at higher levels than Democrats. Democrats, the voter turnout among Democrats is historically lower than it is among Republicans. Republicans are more likely than Democrats to vote.
That is true.
That's why the Democrats have had to focus so much on get out the vote campaigns and voter registration campaigns. And that may be what's different about the 2020 results, is that you had such concerted efforts, particularly in places like Georgia with Stacey Abrams, and registering new voters that allowed, the Democrats to prevail in those elections.
The amount of Texas Republican registered voters has started to go down, and Democrats started winning more elections around judges and all this stuff. So then the Republicans started to get together towards the end of 2019, and they started pushing it more. But Democrats were literally running Texas for a little bit. It was almost about to flip.
Well, as I said in the last class meeting, you might not have been here in the last class meeting, but as I said in the last class meeting, no Democrat has won statewide election in Texas since 1995 or 1994. They're all Republicans. Now, before that, there was a little period of transition in the 1980s and early 1990s. But before that, if you go back to the 1970s and before that, Texas was a one-party Democratic state. All right, just before we run out of time, I want to just, this is not going to be up here long enough for you to get all this down. Again, I just kind of want you to get an indication. Notice that in many of these policy areas, and again, I really probably should update this data because it's getting a little bit old, but I don't think it's changed too much. Okay, Texas's ranking among the states. Notice it's in the bottom half of the states and in the bottom few states in a lot of these areas. Okay. Let's look at taxes because we're almost out of time here. Okay. One of the things that I think Elazar would point to as a good piece of evidence supporting the idea of the traditionalistic culture is he would say you should expect to see regressive taxes. in traditionalistic communities. Now, some of you have probably come across the distinction between progressive taxes and regressive taxes in other things that you've done, other classes that you've taken or things that you've read and so on. Very simply, what we mean by a regressive tax is a tax where the relationship between the effective tax rate and income is inverse. That is to say, the higher a person's income or a household's income, the lower tax rate that they pay, right? And vice versa. The lower the income, the higher the effective tax rate. And that graph is showing this as plain as day, right? This is from a publication called Who Pays? A Distributional Analysis of Taxes in All 50 States. And this particularly is referring to the tax burden in Texas, where you can see that the lowest 20% of income earners in Texas have the highest effective tax rate, and the top 5%, let's just go, well, we can maybe this 20% here has the lowest effective tax rate. That is the essence of a regressive tax. A progressive tax is one where the more income, the higher the effective tax rate. Okay. Now, what accounts for regressive taxes? Well, usually states that depend on sales taxes, and Texas is one of those states. We don't have an income tax in Texas, but Texas is one of those states that depends heavily on sales tax to generate revenue for both state and local government. This is not a Republican argument. This is not a Democratic argument. This is not a liberal argument. This is not a conservative argument. Anyone who knows anything about tax policy in the United States of America and Texas will tell you that sales taxes are regressive. The only real question is, are you okay with that? You know, that's something you have to wrestle with, not for me to tell you, but you know, there are many people obviously who would attack this as being fundamentally unfair. Yes, sir.
Well, I think one thing you can say is when a larger business is focusing on increasing business, that also increases sales, so that also makes that sales tax more effective at generating revenue.
Well, but that's what, maybe it makes it, maybe there's an argument to be made that some people want to make there, but again, it's what we're really trying to focus on here is the effect of taxes on individuals and households. And so when you focus on the effective tax rate means the percentage of income paid in taxes. What we find is that people who are on the lower end of the income scale in Texas pay more of their income in taxes than people at the upper end of the income scale. And that's just a fairness question. And that's, so as a fairness question, it's not something I can tell you how to think on that. You know, your concept of fairness may be different from my concept, but there's no debating the reality that it's regressive. Okay, property taxes tend to be regressive. Okay, excise taxes, we depend heavily in Texas on excise taxes. Those are very regressive. Things like cigarette taxes and alcohol taxes. People at the lower end of the income scale tend to pay a higher percentage of their income in those kinds of taxes. Okay. All right, we're out of time. I hope you got a little bit of sense of what Elazar is talking about. We'll move on to the next topic. I think it's on the Texas Constitution, right? Next week. Yes.